Glen Edward Rogers spent nearly 30 years on death row, his life ticking away in a concrete cell at Florida's Union Correctional Institution. On May 15th, 2025, the state of Florida ended his story with a lethal injection. But to understand how a man became known as the Casanova Killer and the cross-country killer, we need to rewind to where it all began. A small, gritty town in Ohio, where a boy's troubled childhood set the stage for a dark and deadly path. What turned Glen Rogers into a monster? Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications for more gripping crime stories. Leave a comment below. Where are you watching from? What's running through your mind as this case unfolds? Your thoughts matter. Let's go back to the start. Glen Edward Rogers was born on July 15, 1962, in Hamilton, Ohio, a working-class town about 20 miles north of Cincinnati. It was a place of steel mills and factory smokestacks, where life revolved around hard labor and harder times. Glen was the second youngest of 7 children, born to parents who were already worn down by raising his 6 older siblings. His father, Claude Sr., worked at a paper mill, but his heavy drinking often left the family scraping by. His mother, Edna, was a battered woman, struggling to hold the household together under the weight of her husband's rage. Court records paint a grim picture: a dilapidated house, a father who'd fire guns outside in drunken fits, and a mother who lashed out at her kids when the stress became too much. For young Glen, home was a battlefield. His father's alcoholism fueled violent outbursts. Court documents describe Claude Sr. breaking furniture and terrorizing the family, with Glen and his siblings often caught in the crossfire. Edna, overwhelmed and desperate, wasn't much of a safe haven either. She'd punish the kids harshly for small mistakes, like waking their father from a drunken nap. One chilling story from Glen's brother Claude Jr. tells of Edna holding Glen's head underwater in the bathtub as punishment for playing too loudly. Another time, she nearly smothered him in a fit of anger. These weren't isolated moments. They were the rhythm of Glen's childhood. Glen was different from the start. Born after a difficult birth, he struggled with sleeping disorders and ADHD, his small body always in motion, banging his head repeatedly as if trying to shake something loose. Doctors noted his impulsiveness and his trouble handling stress. By the time he was 10, things got darker. Court records later revealed deeply disturbing details. Glen had been repeatedly violated and mistreated, often by people close to the family. He was even exploited for money by individuals who should have protected him. This trauma, buried deep in his psyche, would resurface years later in defense arguments, with lawyers claiming it shaped the man he became. But was that enough to explain what he'd do next? By his teens, Glen was already slipping into trouble. He and his siblings were rarely disciplined for small crimes, like burglarizing neighbors' homes. It was almost expected in a family stretched thin, where survival often meant bending the rules. Glen dropped out of school early, barely making it through middle school. He started using alcohol and drugs, feeding a growing anger that simmered beneath his charming blue eyes. He worked odd jobs, driving a school bus, even serving as a confidential informant for a local narcotics unit in Hamilton, but nothing stuck. The chaos of his childhood followed him, a shadow he couldn't outrun. At 15, Glen was already a thief, stealing to get by, his resentment growing with every hardship. Those who knew him described a boy who could be charismatic, even likable. But there was an edge to him, a spark of rage that could flare without warning. By the time he was 20, he'd left Hamilton, drifting across the country, picking up work at carnivals and fairs. He was handsome, smooth-talking, with a smile that could disarm anyone. But behind that charm, something sinister was brewing. What would push Glen Rogers from petty crimes to a cross-country killing spree? That's where the story takes a deadly turn. In the fall of 1995, Glen Edward Rogers, now known as the Casanova Killer for his ability to charm women, was convicted of 2 brutal murders and suspected in many more. His crimes shattered families, leaving a scar on every town he passed through. But how did a man with a knack for blending in become one of the FBI's 10 most wanted? Let's dive into the chilling events of 1995, the lives he stole, and the evidence that finally brought him down. By September 1995, 33-year-old Glen Rogers was a man on the move, drifting from state to state, working odd jobs at carnivals and bars. His blonde good looks and smooth talk made him irresistible to some, but beneath the charm was a predator. Rogers had a pattern. He targeted women in their 30s, often with reddish hair, luring them with his charisma before turning violent. His crime spree began on September 28, 1995. In over 6 weeks, he left a string of bodies in his wake. Let's walk through the timeline of his known murders, starting with a tragedy in California. On September 28, 1995, Sandra Gallagher, a 33-year-old mother, was seen drinking with Rogers at a bar in Van Nuys, California. Sandra had reddish hair and a warm smile, but she was vulnerable, struggling after a recent breakup. Rogers, fresh off a construction job, bought her drinks, his charm pulling her in. The next day, her body was found inside her truck, parked near Rogers' apartment. The vehicle had been set on fire, but investigators later determined she'd been raped and strangled before the flames consumed her. Her family was devastated, left with only memories of a woman who loved life. But Rogers was already gone, heading east. Where would he strike next? By late October 1995, Rogers was in Jackson, Mississippi. On October 30th, 34-year-old Linda Price, another redhead, welcomed Rogers into her life after meeting him at a local bar. Linda's sister, Carol, later told police they'd planned for her grandchildren to trick-or-treat at Linda's apartment on Halloween. But when they arrived, Linda didn't answer the door. Rogers was gone. Inside, police found Linda's body in her bathtub, strangled, her life stolen in her own home. Her family was shattered, their holiday plans replaced with grief. Rogers, meanwhile, was already on the move again, heading to Florida. On November 5, 1995, Rogers walked into the Showtown bar in Gibsonton, Florida, a small town known for its carnival workers. There he met 34-year-old Tina Marie Cribbs, a kind-hearted woman with reddish hair. Rogers bought drinks for Tina and her friends, his charm winning her over. Later he asked her for a ride. She agreed, not knowing it would be her last act of kindness. 2 days later, on November 7th, a cleaning staff member at the Tampa 8 Inn found Tina's body in a bathtub in Rogers' motel room. She'd been stabbed in the chest and buttocks, her clothes still on, a shallow wound on her arm suggesting she'd fought back. Her family was left in pieces, grappling with the loss of a woman who always put others first. But Rogers wasn't done. Days later, in Bossier City, Louisiana, Rogers met 37-year-old Andy Giles Sutton at a local bar. Like his other victims, Andy had reddish hair and was in her 30s. On November 9, 1995, her body was found, stabbed to death, her life cut short after a night with Rogers. The brutality stunned her friends, who described her as vibrant and trusting. Rogers' pattern was clear: charm, kill, move on. But his luck was about to run out. How did the police finally catch this elusive killer? The investigation into Glen Rogers' crimes was a race against time. By November 1995, police across multiple states were piecing together a chilling pattern. The breakthrough came in Florida, with the murder of Tina Marie Cribbs. On November 7, 1995, a cleaning staff member at the Tampa 8 Inn discovered Tina's body in a bathtub in Rogers' room. The motel clerk confirmed Rogers had checked in days earlier and paid for an extra night, leaving a "Do Not Disturb" sign on the door. This gave police their first solid lead. Forensic evidence was key. At the Tampa crime scene, investigators found 2 of Rogers' fingerprints on a receipt inside Tina's wallet, which was later recovered at a rest stop on Interstate 10 near Tallahassee. His watch was found under Tina's body, linking him directly to the murder. The room's key was found in his luggage when he was arrested. A forensic pathologist testified that Tina had been stabbed twice, with bruises and a defensive wound on her arm, showing she'd fought for her life. No semen was found, but the physical evidence was overwhelming. In California, Sandra Gallagher's case was tied to Rogers through eyewitnesses who saw them together at the bar. The burned truck near his apartment was a damning clue, though the fire destroyed much of the forensic evidence. In Mississippi, Linda Price's murder was linked to Rogers through witness accounts placing him with her before she vanished. In Louisiana, Andy Sutton's case followed the same pattern, with witnesses confirming Rogers was the last person seen with her. But there was more to Rogers' past that made him a prime suspect. Rogers' prior criminal history painted a picture of a man spiraling toward violence. Starting in his teens, he was arrested for theft, assault, and arson in Ohio. By his 20s, he'd been convicted of public drunkenness, burglary, and assault, with multiple women accusing him of physical abuse. In 1993, he was suspected in the death of his 72-year-old housemate, Mark Peters, found tied to a chair in an abandoned cabin owned by Rogers' family in Kentucky. Though never charged, this case raised red flags. His pattern of targeting vulnerable women, often in bars, and his nomadic lifestyle made him a ghost, until the FBI placed him on their 10 most wanted list in 1995. On November 13, 1995, Rogers' run ended in Kentucky, 120 miles from his hometown of Hamilton, Ohio. A state police detective spotted him driving Tina Cribbs' white Ford Festiva. After a high-speed chase, where Rogers, drunk, tossed an empty beer can at a police cruiser, he was arrested. Inside his luggage, police found the motel key and other items tying him to Tina's murder. His charm couldn't save him now. When Kentucky police arrested Glen Rogers on November 13, 1995, he had a story ready. Rogers claimed he was innocent of murder. For the murder of Tina Marie Cribbs in Tampa, Florida, he admitted to being with her at the Showtown bar on November 5, 1995, but said she gave him a ride to the Tampa 8 Inn, where they parted ways. He insisted he didn't kill her, claiming he left the motel alone and only took her car to get away. For Sandra Gallagher's murder in California, Rogers went further, taking the stand in his 1999 trial to proclaim his innocence. He said he met Gallagher at McRed's bar in Van Nuys on September 28, 1995, but denied any involvement in her death, suggesting someone else could have attacked her after he left. His charm was his weapon, but the evidence told a different story. But his claim of innocence didn't hold up against the physical proof and witness accounts. But the trials were where the real drama unfolded. Rogers faced two separate trials. First, in Florida, he was tried for the murder of Tina Marie Cribbs. The trial began in 1997 in Hillsborough County. The defense tried to argue reasonable doubt, pointing to the lack of semen evidence and suggesting someone else could have entered the room. But the fingerprints, watch, and motel key were too strong. On July 11, 1997, the jury found Rogers guilty of first-degree murder, armed robbery, and grand theft of a motor vehicle. The penalty phase was intense. Rogers' team called his brother Claude and two experts, Dr. Michael Maher, a psychiatrist, and Dr. Robert Berlin, a forensic psychologist, who testified Rogers had brain damage, a rare genetic disorder called porphyria, and mental health issues from childhood trauma. Despite this, the jury unanimously recommended death, and the judge agreed, sentencing Rogers to death on July 11, 1997. In 1998, Rogers was extradited to California to face trial for Sandra Gallagher's murder. The trial began in Los Angeles County in 1999. Prosecutors detailed how Rogers met Gallagher at McRed's bar on September 28, 1995, after she won $1,200 in the lottery. Her body was found the next day, strangled and burned in her truck near Rogers' apartment. Rogers took the stand, insisting he was innocent, but eyewitnesses and the proximity of the crime scene to his home were damning. On June 22, 1999, the jury convicted him of first-degree murder and arson. During the penalty phase, the jury learned of Rogers' other suspected killings, including those in Mississippi and Louisiana. On July 16, 1999, he was sentenced to death again. His family, including his mother and brother, sat silently in the courtroom, while Gallagher's family wept. 2 death sentences, 2 states. But would Rogers find a way out? Rogers didn't give up. He launched a series of appeals in both Florida and California, fighting to overturn his convictions and death sentences. His legal team focused on 3 main arguments: mental health issues, childhood trauma, and procedural errors in his trials. Let's break down the key battles and what the courts decided. In Florida, Rogers' appeals began with a direct appeal to the Florida Supreme Court, filed on September 11, 1997. His lawyers argued the state didn't present enough evidence for first-degree murder, claiming the prosecution failed to prove premeditation or felony murder. They also said the trial court ignored mitigating factors, like Rogers' mental health. The defense pointed to testimony from Dr. Maher and Dr. Berland, who diagnosed Rogers with brain damage, porphyria, and a chronic ambulatory psychotic disturbance with schizophrenia, paranoia, and mania, worsened by alcohol and drug use. They argued this should have led to a life sentence, not death. Rogers also claimed the court erred by allowing a witness to mention his California misdemeanor and letting prosecutors make improper closing arguments. On March 1, 2001, the Florida Supreme Court rejected these arguments, affirming the conviction and sentence. They found the evidence overwhelming and the prosecutorial comments didn't rise to fundamental error. A rehearing was denied on April 24, 2001. Rogers kept fighting. In 2005, he filed a 3.850 motion for post-conviction relief in Florida, claiming ineffective assistance of counsel. He argued his lawyers failed to properly investigate his mental health and childhood trauma. On April 11, 2005, the Florida Supreme Court denied this motion, saying his counsel adequately presented mitigating evidence, including expert testimony. A habeas corpus petition filed on September 21, 2005, raised similar claims but was denied on January 18, 2007. Rogers took his case to federal court, filing a habeas petition in the U.S. District Court on August 3, 2007. He again argued ineffective counsel and insufficient evidence, but the petition was denied on February 19, 2010. Appeals to the 11th Circuit and the U.S. Supreme Court were rejected by June 14, 2010 and October 21, 2010, respectively. In 2019, Rogers tried a new angle. He filed a third successive post-conviction motion in Florida, claiming newly discovered evidence of childhood sexual abuse and trafficking in Hamilton, Ohio, and at the Training Institute of Central Ohio. He said these memories were repressed until discussions with clemency counsel in 2019. His lawyers argued this trauma should have been considered as mitigation to spare him the death penalty. The circuit court denied the motion on October 28, 2021, ruling the abuse didn't qualify as newly discovered evidence because Rogers' siblings knew about it, and his lawyers could have found it with due diligence. The Florida Supreme Court agreed, affirming the denial. As his execution loomed, Rogers made a final stand. On April 15, 2025, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed his death warrant, setting the execution for May 15, 2025. Rogers filed a fourth successive post-conviction motion on April 20, 2025, raising 3 claims. His lawyers had a conflict of interest, the childhood abuse warranted a life sentence, and his porphyria made lethal injection cruel and unusual due to potential pain from the drug etomidate. The circuit court denied the motion as untimely or meritless. On May 9, 2025, the Florida Supreme Court upheld the denial, stating the injection protocol was constitutional and the abuse claims were procedurally barred. A last-ditch appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court on May 14, 2025, was rejected. On May 15, 2025, Glen Edward Rogers, the Casanova Killer, faced his final reckoning at Florida State Prison. After nearly 30 years on death row for the brutal murders of Tina Marie Cribbs and Sandra Gallagher, his time was up. But the road to the execution chamber wasn't smooth. Legal battles and medical concerns raised questions until the very end. What happened in those final hours? What did Rogers say as he faced death? And did his cryptic words hint at secrets he'd never reveal? Rogers' execution was set for 6 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on May 15, 2025, at Florida State Prison in Rayford, following a death warrant signed by Governor Ron DeSantis on April 15, 2025. But the lead-up wasn't without drama. Rogers' legal team fought hard, filing a final appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court on May 9, 2025, claiming his rare blood disorder, porphyria, could make the lethal injection process excruciatingly painful. They argued that etomidate, the sedative used in Florida's 3-drug cocktail, etomidate, rocuronium bromide, and potassium acetate, could trigger a painful reaction due to his condition, violating the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. The Florida Supreme Court rejected this claim on May 9, 2025, stating the protocol was constitutional and Rogers' condition didn't warrant a stay. The U.S. Supreme Court agreed, denying his petition without dissent on May 14, 2025. No medical complications were reported during the execution itself, but the last-minute legal fight kept tensions high. Rogers woke up at 3:45 a.m. on his final day, according to the Florida Department of Corrections. He was described as calm and compliant, a stark contrast to the violent man who charmed and killed his victims. For his last meal, he chose comfort food, pizza, chocolate cake, and soda. It was a simple request, almost ordinary, for a man whose crimes were anything but. He had two visitors that day, his wife, who saw him in the morning, and his brother Clay, who visited the day before from Kentucky. As the clock ticked closer to 6 p.m., about 30 witnesses gathered, including Hillsborough State Attorney Susie Lopez and family members of his victims, like Randy and Amy Robertson, children of Andy Giles Sutton, one of Rogers' suspected victims. Would Rogers show remorse in his final moments? Or would he leave the world with one last twist? At 6 p.m., the curtain rose in the execution chamber, revealing Rogers on the gurney. His blonde hair was cropped short, his face framed by a light gray beard. Intravenous lines pierced both arms, secured with leather straps, as a white sheet covered most of his body. 3 men in suits stood nearby, one taking notes. Rogers blinked rapidly, staring at the ceiling, his mouth slightly open. The lethal injection began at 6:02 p.m., and he lay still, barely moving. At one point, a staff member shook his shoulders and shouted, "Rogers! Rogers!" to check if he was conscious. No response. The process was swift. At 6:16 p.m., Glen Edward Rogers was pronounced dead, the 16th execution in the U.S. and the 5th in Florida that year. Before the drugs flowed, Rogers had a chance to speak. His final words were cryptic and shocking. Addressing the victims' families, he said, "I know there's a lot of questions that you need answers to. I promise you in the near future the questions will be answered, and I hope in some way will bring you closure." Then in a bizarre turn he added, "President Trump, keep making America great. I'm ready to go." He also thanked his wife, who'd visited earlier. The mention of Trump stunned the room. No spiritual advisor was mentioned in reports, suggesting Rogers faced his end without one. What did he mean by questions will be answered? Was he hinting at his claim of killing nearly 70 people, including Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman? That mystery died with him. Glen Edward Rogers' execution closed a dark chapter, bringing a sense of relief to families like Jerry Vallicella, Sandra Gallagher's sister, who said she could finally rest knowing he could harm no one else. But his cryptic final words, and unproven claims of dozens more murders, leave a haunting question mark. Was justice served for Tina, Sandra, and the others? Or does the truth of Rogers' full crimes remain buried? Tell us in the comments. Do you think the execution brought closure? Or are there still too many unanswered questions about the Casanova Killer?